The grocery store was called Westside Market, the kind of place that had existed in the same strip mall for 30 years without changing. Same beige walls, same checkout lanes with their worn rubber belts, same elderly manager who'd been there since the 1990s. Corinne Mitchell had never paid attention to it before. Places like Westside Market were beneath her notice. But her usual place, the upscale organic market 4 miles away, had closed unexpectedly for remodeling. The irony wasn't lost on Corinne as she pushed her cart through the automatic doors on a Wednesday afternoon. Her nose wrinkled slightly against the smell of industrial cleaner and produce that wasn't quite as fresh as what she was accustomed to. She was dressed for a lunch meeting that she'd bailated out of early, a cream-colored Chanel suit, oversized sunglasses despite being indoors, and her phone already in her hand before she'd made it past the produce section. She'd been texting her assistant, demanding confirmation about the Henderson account when she bumped the cart. It wasn't hard. It was more of a soft collision, the kind that happens hundreds of times a day in grocery stores. But Corinne had been distracted, moving fast, and the other cart, pushed by an elderly man in a worn green jacket and a Mariners baseball cap, had been moving slowly, deliberately, as if its occupant had nowhere to be. "Excuse me," the old man said, gently revering his cart to give her space. Corinne didn't respond. She'd already moved past him, her eyes back on her phone. She selected 3 containers of organic kale, 2 bottles of cold-pressed juice at $20 each, and some prepared salads from the deli section. Everything was a transaction to her, a series of inputs that produced outputs, fuel for her body, fuel for her appearance, fuel for her image. She was at the checkout when she realized something was wrong with her debit card. The transaction kept declining. Corinne felt her face flush, that immediate, irrational anger that arose whenever anything interrupted her frictionless existence. "Try again," she snapped at the teenage cashier. The girl, Melissa, according to her name tag, tried again, declined. "Try it as credit," Corinne demanded. "I did, ma'am. It's not going through. Do you have another?" "That's not possible. Run it again." By this time, there were 3 people in line behind her. Corinne could feel their eyes. She could feel the weight of their judgment, as if they were all silently concluding that she was poor, that she couldn't afford her groceries, that she was some kind of failure. The feeling made her want to scream. "I have money," Corinne said loudly, as if addressing the entire store. "I have more money than everyone in this store combined. Your system is broken." "I'm really sorry, ma'am," Melissa said, and she genuinely sounded sorry. "Would you like to call your bank, or I can hold these items while you—" "This is unacceptable. I need to speak to your manager." The old man in the green jacket was still in the store. Corinne noticed him now because he was the only person who wasn't staring at her with open curiosity or disapproval. He was in the back, near the pharmacy, studying the selection of over-the-counter cold medicines with the focused attention of someone who had nowhere better to be. He was probably in his 80s, Corinne thought. Thin, weathered, the kind of person who seemed to be slowly fatting from the world. The manager came out, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes and her own name tag that read PATRICIA. She went through the same routine. The card didn't work. Corinne demanded answers. Patricia remained calm, professional, the way a person does when they've had variations of this same conversation 1,000 times. "I'm sure it's just a temporary issue with the bank," Patricia said. "If you'd like, I can hold these items and you can come back after you've sorted it out." "I'm not leaving here without my groceries," Corinne said. "I'm calling American Express right now." She didn't make the call. Instead, she stood at the counter, scrolling furiously through her phone, creating a narrative in her head about how this was discrimination, how this was probably fraud, how she might sue the store. She was so absorbed in her internal monologue of grievance that she didn't notice the old man approaching. "Excuse me," he said, and his voice was soft enough that Corinne almost didn't hear him. "I couldn't help but overhear." Corinne looked up, her expression already prepared to be dismissive. "I'd like to pay for her groceries," the old man said, looking at Patricia. "If that's all right." It was the kind of gesture that belonged to a different era, Corinne thought immediately. Quaint, pathetic, something a person did when they were trying to feel noble without actually accomplishing anything meaningful. "That's really kind," Patricia said, and Corinne could hear the relief in her voice, the desire to have this disruption resolved. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure," the old man said. He was reaching for his wallet now, worn leather, the kind that had been carried in the same pocket for decades. He pulled out a credit card. It was accepted immediately. Corinne stood there, her face burning, as the old man paid for her groceries. She couldn't bring herself to thank him. It felt too much like admitting defeat, like accepting charity, like acknowledging that there was any scenario in which she needed help from a stranger in a faded green jacket. "You don't have to thank me," the old man said, as if reading her mind. He was smiling at her, not mockingly, but with a kind of sad recognition, as if he was seeing something in her that she couldn't quite see in herself. "I won't," Corinne said coldly. "And you shouldn't have done that. I'll have my assistant reimburse you and we can arrange." "No need," the old man said. He was already turning away, his own purchases unpacked. A rotisserie chicken, some brown rice, a container of mixed vegetables, a single banana. $70 worth of groceries, paid for with a card that worked perfectly fine. Corinne watched him leave the store, pushing his cart slowly toward a parking lot where an old Honda Civic waited, sun-faded and dented. She felt something twist inside her chest, not quite shame, because she wasn't capable of that, but something adjacent to it. A disturbance in her carefully constructed world, an imbalance that needed to be corrected. She turned to Patricia. "Do you know that man?" "No," Patricia said, already moving to help bag Corinne's groceries. "But he comes in sometimes, very quiet, very polite, not like most people." The implication hung there, unspoken but perfectly clear. Corinne grabbed her bags before Patricia could offer to help. She walked out into the parking lot, scanning the vehicles for the old man. But he was already gone. His little Civic vanished into the afternoon traffic. She sat in her own car, a new Mercedes, dark blue, cost more than most people's houses, and tried to call her bank. After 20 minutes on hold, she learned that her card had been flagged for suspicious activity. There had been unauthorized charges from overseas. It would take 3 to 5 business days to resolve. In the meantime, all her cards had been frozen. Corinne hung up and sat in silence, gripping the steering wheel. This wasn't supposed to happen to her. Things like this happen to other people, people without resources, without connections, without the kind of privilege that insulated you from the friction and failure of normal life. She called her assistant, Rachel. "Rachel, I need you to fix this," Corinne said without preamble. "I need access to cash by tomorrow, I don't care how. The Henderson account, it's closed, right?" "Well, yes and no," Rachel said carefully. "I mean, yes, we closed it, but there might be some lingering issues, the lawsuit." "There is no lawsuit that I've lost," Corinne cut her off. "Fix it, and find out who that manager is, the one from the grocery store, James something." "I'm not sure what you—" "Just do it, Rachel. You have until tomorrow." Corinne drove home to her apartment in the Pearl District, a place that was all glass and steel and carefully curated minimalism. She lived alone by choice, having discovered early in her career that relationships were inefficient. They required emotional labor without providing tangible returns. She had colleagues. She had people who did things for her. She had herself. She poured a glass of wine and sat on her sofa and thought about the old man's face. There was something familiar about it, though she was certain they'd never met. She would have remembered someone like that. Someone so thoroughly unremarkable, so completely lacking in status or ambition or the kinds of qualities that usually drew her attention. That night she dreamed of parking lots and voices saying her name, though no one she recognized. "There was a James Sullivan," Rachel said, her voice cautious over the phone. "He was a store manager at a grocery store chain about 15 years ago, but Corinne, I don't think." "What happened to him?" Corinne demanded. "That's where it gets. Well, there was an incident. There was a complaint filed against him. A customer claimed he'd been inappropriate, and then there were accusations that he'd tampered with something, and I honestly don't remember all the details. It was a long time ago." "Find the details," Corinne said, "and find out if he's still alive, and if so, find out where he works now." She hung up without waiting for a response. Corinne had learned long ago that most people would move mountains if you treated asking them as equivalent to commanding them. They preferred it, actually. It relieved them of the burden of decision-making. She spent the rest of the morning in meetings. The Henderson account was indeed a problem. They'd withdrawn their business 6 months ago, citing concerns about our business practices in a way that was vague enough to be legally untouchable but clear enough to cost her $300,000 in quarterly revenue. She had a conference call scheduled with her business partner, Michael, to discuss whether they should try to win them back or let it go. Let it go, Michael said from his office in San Francisco. They're gone, Karen, we move forward. But Karen couldn't let things go. It was antithetical to her nature. The idea of losing a client, of being rejected, of being found wanting in any way, it created a kind of psychic pressure that she could only relieve through action, through pursuit, through the application of will. She was in this state of determined irritation when Rachel called back. I found him, Rachel said. James Sullivan, he's living in Portland. He works at Westside Market. Karen felt something strange happen in her chest, a kind of backwards lurch, as if time were revering itself and showing her something she'd missed. That's the grocery store where I was yesterday, she said slowly. Yes, Rachel said. I know, and Karen, about that incident, I found the old report. It was filed by you. The parking lot of Westside Market looked the same at 4:15 p.m. as it had the day before, but now everything seemed charged with different meaning. Karen sat in her car, a loaner Mercedes, because the dealership was working on her regular one, and watched the store's entrance. At 4:47 p.m., James Sullivan walked out. She recognized him immediately, the old man from the checkout, the one who'd paid for her groceries, the one whose face had seemed vaguely familiar in a way she couldn't quite place. She got out of her car and approached him. He was loading groceries into his Civic, more of the same humble selections he always bought, a life of deliberate modesty. James Sullivan, she said. He turned. For a moment she saw something flicker across his face, recognition, yes, but also something else. Something that looked like resignation, as if he'd been waiting for this moment for a very long time. Yes, he said quietly. I'm Karen Mitchell. She watched as his expression shifted. The resignation deepened into something that might have been sadness, or might have been the complex accumulation of 15 years of resentment that he'd learned to bury under civility. I know who you are, he said. Then you know why I'm here, Karen said. It wasn't a question. I have a pretty good idea, James said. He finished loading his groceries and closed the trunk of his car. I wondered if you'd recognize me yesterday. I wasn't sure you would. People usually don't. Recognize you? I didn't know you were in that store yesterday until just now, Karen said. But I do remember you, James Sullivan, manager at It Was Garden Fresh, right? About 15 years ago. 15 years, 2 months, James said. Not that I'm counting or anything. Karen felt a flush of something, annoyance maybe at his tone. If you have a problem with what happened, you should have dealt with it at the time, through proper legal channels. I tried, James said. He pulled out his car keys. I hired a lawyer. The lawyer said it would cost me $30,000 to fight it, and even if I won, the damage was already done. Turns out, people believe the stories they're told more readily than they believe the truth. My reputation was destroyed before I had a chance to defend it. What story? Karen asked, though something in her was already beginning to remember. To piece together fragments that she'd deliberately buried, that she'd spent 15 years not thinking about, that she'd buried under layers of professional accomplishment and carefully constructed self-image. The story where I supposedly did something inappropriate to you, James said. His voice was level, matter-of-fact, as if he'd rehearsed this statement many times in his head. I was your manager for 6 months. You worked in the deli. You were, what were you, 23? 24. I know how old I was, Karen snapped. And you decided that I was in your way, James continued, as if she hadn't spoken. There was a position opening up in corporate, assistant regional manager. You wanted it. You thought I was going to recommend myself for it instead. So you filed a complaint. You said I'd made an inappropriate comment, and then you said I'd touched you in a way that made you uncomfortable. Karen felt her body go cold. The memory was there, suddenly, vivid and terrible and undeniable. She'd been in the walk-in cooler pulling inventory. James had come in and said something. What had he said? Something about how hard she was working, how dedicated she was, how he thought she had real potential. It had been a compliment, a kind of mentorship moment, and she had looked at him and made a calculation. She had calculated that his compliment could become something else if she framed it correctly, that his kindness could be weaponized, that the story she told would be more compelling than any story he could tell to contradict it. You're right, she said. The words tasted like metal on her tongue. I remember now. Do you? James asked. He was looking at her intently, and there was something almost scientific in his gaze, as if he was trying to determine what kind of person deliberately destroys another human being for professional advantage. "Do you remember what happened to me after you filed that complaint?" Corinne didn't answer immediately. The truth was she didn't remember. She'd gotten the job, had moved to corporate, had climbed the ladder, had built the life she'd planned. The aftermath of her accusation had never been her concern. She'd filed the report, given her statement, and moved on. Whatever had happened to James Sullivan after that was not something she'd thought to track. "I was fired," James said, since she wasn't answering. "They did an investigation. There were no witnesses, but corporate decided it was better to be safe than sorry. My career in retail management was over. I was blacklisted. No one would hire me. I spent 2 years working minimum wage jobs, dishwasher, janitor, manual labor. My wife left me. She said she couldn't be married to someone who'd been accused of something like that, guilty or not. Couldn't be associated with that kind of stigma." "I didn't know that," Corinne said, and it was true. She hadn't known. She also hadn't cared. She'd won what she wanted, and that had been the end of it. "No," James agreed. "You didn't. Why would you? I was just a stepping stone, just something in your way." He opened his car door. "Wait," Corinne said. "I'm sorry." The words sounded pathetic even to her own ears. Insufficient, inadequate to the scale of the harm she'd caused. James looked at her for a long moment. "Are you?" he asked finally. "Or are you sorry that I'm here to remind you that you did it? Are you sorry about the thing, or sorry that the thing has consequences?" Corinne couldn't answer that, because she didn't know the difference anymore. "I'm going to be leaving Portland," James said. "I've saved up enough. I'm going to move up north somewhere quiet. I'm going to start over again. Not because I'm running from you. I made peace with what happened a long time ago, but because I realize I never actually started living. I've been surviving. There's a difference." He got into his car. The window was still open, and he looked at Corinne one more time. "The thing that's interesting," he said, "is that I could have done something about this a long time ago. I could have pursued legal action, or I could have gone to your company and made a fuss, tried to salvage my reputation. But I realized something. Revenge just adds another layer to the misery. It doesn't actually fix anything. It just means 2 people are suffering instead of 1. He started the car. "So that's what I did instead. I forgave you. Not because you deserved it, but because carrying that anger around was killing me, and I didn't want to give you that power. I didn't want you to be the reason I died angry." He pulled out of the parking lot before Corinne could respond. She stood in the empty lot as afternoon became evening, as the sun descended toward the horizon, and felt something that she'd successfully avoided for 15 years, genuine remorse. The Henderson account withdrawal wasn't actually about a lawsuit that hadn't happened. Rachel, having been given a direct order to find out about James Sullivan, had also found something else while she was digging through old files. A memo from Henderson's purchasing director, buried in a folder from 6 months ago. The memo mentioned that Corinne Mitchell's firm had consistently overcharged them. Not egregiously, nothing that would be grounds for legal action, but systematically, methodically, relying on the fact that Henderson's procurement team wouldn't scrutinize every invoice too closely. An extra 2% here, an inflated consulting fee there, billing for hours that hadn't actually been worked. $300,000 over the course of 2 years. Rachel brought this memo to Corinne's attention on a Thursday morning, her voice careful and clinical, as if she was reporting something that had nothing to do with her boss's integrity. "This is probably why they left," Rachel said. "I think they figured it out." Corinne took the memo and read it 3 times, as if the words might change if she looked at them long enough. "This is speculation," she said finally. "There's no evidence that we did anything wrong." "Well," Rachel said, and there was something different in her tone now, "the memo specifically lists the transactions that they believe were overbilled, and our records match exactly. So nothing," Corinne said. "We can dispute it if they try to make an issue of it." But she knew that was lying. She'd known what she was doing when she submitted those invoices. She'd known that they were overcharging. It had seemed like a victimless crime at the time. Henderson was a large corporation. They could absorb the losses, and it was just the way business worked. Everyone doing their little bit of small-scale dishonesty that never quite rose to the level of actual fraud. That night, Corinne attended a networking event in the Pearl District, a cocktail party for Portland's tech and business elite. She'd been going to these kinds of events for years, had built much of her business through them. had learned to navigate the careful choreography of name-dropping and strategic alliance building that made up the social fabric of the city's professional class. But this time, she felt different. She felt like she was seeing everyone there, including herself, from a distance. All these people, carefully dressed and carefully voiced, all of them trying so hard to project success and intelligence and worthiness. How many of them, she wondered, had built their empires on small manipulations and calculated cruelties? How many of them would fall apart if you pulled on the right threads? She was on her third glass of wine, standing by the appetizer table and pretending to be interested in a venture capitalist's thoughts on the real estate market, when her phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. "I watched you last night in your car. You looked scared. I've never seen you look scared before." Corinne's blood went cold. She immediately opened her Maps app to see where the message was coming from, but it showed no location data. She looked around the crowded room, suddenly aware of how many faces she didn't recognize, how many people could be standing mere feet away from her. She left the event immediately and drove home, checking her mirrors obsessively. The message sat in her unread notifications, pulsing like a threat. She called the police. "I received a threatening message," she told the officer who responded, a middle-aged woman named Detective Peterson. "Someone was watching me. They know where I live, they know." "Do you know who sent it?" Detective Peterson asked, her tone already suggesting skepticism. "No, that's why I'm calling." "Have there been other messages? Has anyone made threats?" "Just the one," Corinne admitted. "Do you have any enemies? Anyone you've had disputes with?" Corinne thought of James Sullivan, but he'd been at work when she was parked outside the grocery store. She'd confirmed that. Besides, it didn't fit. James wasn't the type to send threatening messages. He was sad and worn down and had decided that forgiveness was more important than revenge. But someone else knew where she lived. Someone else had been watching her. "I can file a report," Detective Peterson said, "but honestly, without any explicit threats or repeated contact, there's not much I can do. You might want to consider upgrading your security, being more careful about where you share your address." After the officer left, Corinne double-checked all her locks. She'd never thought about security before. She'd assumed that her world was inherently safe, that bad things happened to other people, that consequence was something that applied to everyone except her. She didn't sleep that night. She sat on her bed, refreshing her phone constantly, waiting for another message that never came. The next morning, there was an article in the Portland Business Journal. It was small, not front page, but prominent enough that people in her industry would see it. It was about ethical violations in management consulting, about how firms were increasingly being called out for inflated billing and overstated deliverables. It didn't mention her firm by name, but it cited 3 specific case studies, and one of them was suspiciously similar to the Henderson situation. By noon, her phone was ringing off the hook. Clients were calling, asking pointed questions about their invoices. Michael was calling from San Francisco, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Corinne, what is this? What did you do?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Corinne said, but they both knew that was a lie. The Henderson thing, was that real? Did we actually overcharge them? The question hung in the space between them, and Corinne realized that this was the moment. This was the point at which she could lie, could maintain the fiction, could try to spin a narrative that would protect both of them. "She didn't do that." "Yes," she said, "we did." There was a long silence from Michael's end. "Jesus Christ, Corinne," he said finally. "Jesus Christ." He hung up without saying anything else. By the end of the day, 3 more clients had pulled their business. By the end of the week, 5. The reputation that Corinne had spent 15 years building was collapsing with terrifying speed, and she couldn't stop it because the foundation had been built on lies and manipulation from the start. She sat in her apartment on a Friday night, watching the sunset through her floor-to-ceiling windows, and realized that she was going to lose everything. The company would probably dissolve. Her professional reputation was destroyed. The savings she'd accumulated, she suddenly understood, had been built on the same system of overcharging that was now coming back to haunt her. She opened her laptop and started looking at her client accounts, going back year by year, trying to calculate exactly how much she'd been regularly overbilling. The number was staggering. Not technically fraud, maybe, but ethically indefensible. She was still sitting there at midnight, when she got the second message from the unknown number. I watched you realize what you'd done. That was beautiful. That was almost enough. Corinne stared at the message, her hands shaking. She tried to call the number back. It went straight to a disconnected number. She called Detective Peterson again. The messages are continuing. I'm being stalked. I can try to trace the number, Peterson said, though she didn't sound optimistic. But you should also consider whether these messages might be hoaxes, pranks, or whether there's a personal relationship involved that. There's no personal relationship, Corinne said. This is harassment. But even as she said it, she was wondering if it was true. Was someone actually threatening her, or was she just experiencing the delayed consequences of her own actions in a way that felt like external persecution? She tried to work but couldn't concentrate. She tried to sleep but couldn't quiet her mind. She kept seeing James Sullivan's face, kept hearing his voice explaining in that methodical way of his exactly what she'd done to him and why it had mattered. By Sunday, when no new messages had come, she began to wonder if the whole thing had been a hallucination, a manifestation of her own guilt taking external form. Monday morning, Corinne went to Westside Market at opening time. It was 8 a.m., and the store was nearly empty, just a few early morning shoppers picking up milk or coffee or the ingredients for breakfast. Patricia was working the register. She looked up when Corinne came in and something flickered across her face, recognition, but also something like caution. Is James here? Corinne asked. No, Patricia said. He left. He gave notice on Friday. He's moving north somewhere in Washington. Corinne felt something in her chest compress. The knowledge that she'd been part of the reason for his leaving, that his decision to finally start living came in direct proportion to her falling apart, felt like a horrible symmetry. Did he say where? Corinne asked. No, he kept things private, Patricia said. She was scanning items for another customer, but there was something in her demeanor that suggested she had more to say. But I will tell you, I don't know what happened between you two, and I don't need to know, but he's a good man. Better than most people. If there's some debt you think you owe him, I'd suggest paying it. Corinne left the store without buying anything. She drove home and pulled up her financial records. Then she called a lawyer, a real one, not one of the corporate legal associates she usually worked with, but a criminal defense attorney named David Chen, who came highly recommended for his integrity. I want to do something, she told him without preamble. I want to make restitution for something I did, something that hurt someone, but I'm not sure of the legal implications. David listened while she explained the situation with Henderson, the overbilling, the pattern of small dishonesty that had added up to significant harm. If you voluntarily disclose this and pay restitution, it might mitigate potential legal liability, David said carefully. But it will destroy your business. It will destroy your professional reputation. You'd be admitting to systematic fraud. I know, Corinne said. Are you prepared for that? David asked. Because I need to be clear about what you're asking for. You're asking me to help you confess to something that you might be able to continue to hide. You're asking me to help you turn yourself in, essentially. Yes, Corinne said. David was quiet for a moment. Can I ask why? Corinne thought about how to answer that. She thought about James Sullivan in his faded green jacket, methodically buying his modest groceries, living his small life in the aftermath of her destruction of his larger one. She thought about the way he'd paid for her groceries without expectation of thanks. She thought about the way he'd forgiven her without her even asking. I think I've been living the wrong way, she said finally, and I want to stop. By the end of the week, Corinne had initiated contact with her former clients, all of them, going back years. She disclosed the overbilling, calculated the amounts owed, and offered full restitution plus interest and an apology. The responses ranged from acceptance to threats of legal action to silence. Henderson wrote her back personally. We appreciate the restitution and the apology. We're surprised by this development, but we respect your willingness to acknowledge wrongdoing. We won't be pursuing legal action, but we also won't be doing business with you again. Her business partner, Michael, decided to dissolve the company rather than try to salvage it. You had a good reputation, he told her over the phone, his tone carefully neutral. This is going to cost you everything you've built. I know, Corinne said. And you're doing it anyway. Yes. There was a long pause. Then, I hope whatever you're getting in return is worth it. Karen wasn't sure it would be worth it, actually. But she was beginning to understand that that wasn't the right question to ask. The point wasn't whether it was worth it. The point was that it was necessary. The point was that some debts had to be paid, regardless of the cost. She was in the process of liquidating her investments to cover the restitution when Rachel came into her office. It was actually her apartment now, since Karen had given up the office space, with a strange expression on her face. "I need to show you something," Rachel said. She had her laptop with her. Rachel had been tracking down the messages. Rachel explained, had felt responsible since she'd been the one to send Karen looking for James Sullivan. She'd hired a cybersecurity expert, spent some of her own money, and managed to trace the messages back. "Was your neighbor," Rachel said, pulling up information on her screen. "Your downstairs neighbor, actually. Her name is Patricia Chen. She works at a nursing home. She has a history of vigilantism. She's pursued people online before, people she felt had done harm. She took an interest in your case after reading about the firm's ethical violations in the business journal. She was trying to scare you into confession, I think. Trying to provoke the outcome that actually ended up happening anyway." Karen stared at the screen. Patricia Chen, the same last name as the lawyer she'd hired. She didn't think that was a coincidence. "Does this mean I should press charges?" Rachel asked carefully. "No," Karen said. "Don't press charges." "Are you sure? She was harassing you, threatening you." "Yes, I'm sure," Karen said. "She was trying to make me confront what I'd done, and it worked. Press charges if you want, but I won't be cooperating with the prosecution." Rachel left, confused but accepting. Karen sat alone in her apartment and thought about how justice had come to her in the form of harassment and then kindness. How the universe had conspired, through a woman who worked at a nursing home, through a lawyer who shared the same last name, through a mysterious neighbor, to force her toward the only outcome that actually meant anything. She made a decision. She hired a private investigator to find James Sullivan. It took 3 weeks. He was living in a small town called Bellingham, Washington, about 90 minutes north of Seattle. He'd rented a small house, had taken a job at a community garden center. He'd joined a volunteer organization that helped senior citizens with home repairs and yard work. He was, as he'd said he would be, starting over. Karen drove up to meet him on a cold afternoon in late November. The drive up Interstate 5 gave her too much time to think, too much time to rehearse what she might say, to anticipate his responses. She found his address using the investigator's information and drove past the house 3 times before she had the courage to stop. It was a small, neat cottage with a well-maintained garden. There were early winter vegetables growing in raised beds. It looked like the home of someone who was learning how to build something instead of destroy it. James was in the garden when she pulled up. He was wearing his green jacket, the same one she'd seen him in at the grocery store. He was pulling out dead plants, preparing the garden for winter. He looked up when he heard her car door close. For a moment his face was blank, and then recognition washed across it. "Hello, Karen," he said. "Hello, James," she replied. She walked to where he was standing. This close, she could see the details she'd missed before, the way his hands shook slightly, the faded whiteness in his beard where the weathering had been most severe, the way his eyes were a very light blue, like washed-out denim. "I'm sorry," she said. It was the same apology she'd offered in the parking lot, but this time she meant it differently. This time she wasn't sorry that she'd been caught or that there were consequences. She was sorry for what she'd done purely and simply. "I know you are," James said. He wasn't being unkind exactly, but he also wasn't making it easy for her. "What brings you all the way up here?" "I wanted to tell you something," Karen said. "I wanted you to know that I've made restitution to my clients. I've acknowledged what I did. I've shut down my business. I'm trying to figure out how to live differently." "That's good," James said. He went back to pulling out dead plants. "But I don't think you drove all this way just to tell me that." He was right, she hadn't. She searched for the right words and couldn't find them. "I want to understand," she said finally, "how you forgave me, how you decided that revenge wasn't worth it." James straightened up. He pulled off his work gloves and tucked them into his jacket pocket. "You want to understand, or you want permission to forgive yourself?" The question was sharper than she'd expected, and Karen realized with a kind of painful clarity that it was possible she'd come all this way not to apologize, but to be absolved. To get James to say that it was okay, that he didn't blame her, that everything would be fine. Maybe both, she admitted. I'll tell you how, James said. He gestured for her to sit on a nearby bench, weathered wood, worn smooth by years of use. After you destroyed my career, after my wife left, after I hit bottom, I was angry for a long time. I was angry at you specifically, but I was also angry at the world. I was angry at the unfairness of it all. And that anger was poison. It was eating me from the inside. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. Every thought I had was circular. It all came back to what you'd done. He sat down next to her. And then one day I realized something. My anger wasn't touching you at all. You went on with your life. You became successful. You won. My rage didn't change any of that. The only thing it was doing was destroying me. And that's when I realized the best thing I could do, the only thing that would actually save me, was to let it go. But how, Corinne asked. How do you just let go of something like that? You don't let go of it, James said. You carry it, but you don't let it carry you. You acknowledge what happened, you accept that it happened, and you decide that you're not going to give that person any more of your life. Not your anger, not your energy, not your thoughts. You move forward. Did it work? Corinne asked. Does it feel better? Yes, James said. Significantly, I don't think about that part of my life very often anymore. And when I do, it doesn't hurt like it used to. It's more like looking at an old injury that healed badly. You know it was there, you know it affected you, but it doesn't define you anymore. Corinne felt tears on her face. She wasn't sure when she'd started crying. I don't know if I can do that, she said. I don't know if I can forgive myself. That's a different process than forgiveness, James said. Forgiveness is about letting go of the anger toward the person who hurt you. Forgiveness with yourself is about letting go of the shame, and that's harder. Shame has teeth. It wants to stay. How did you do it? Corinne asked. James looked out at his garden, at the evidence of growth, of care, of the slow work of building something real. I learned that I was more than what I'd done, he said. I learned that being destroyed by someone else didn't have to define me forever, and I built things, real things, things that matter even if they don't matter to anyone but me, a garden, a life, a small amount of peace. He turned to look at her. You're going to have to do the same thing. You're going to have to figure out who you want to be when you're not fighting to prove something. That's going to be harder than any business you've ever run, and you're going to have to be patient with yourself in a way that you've probably never been patient with anything. Corinne sat with that for a moment. I hired a lawyer, she said, and I made restitution, but there are more people I hurt. I need to figure out who else I need to apologize to. That's probably true, James said. And some of them won't accept your apology. Some of them will tell you to go to hell. Some of them might try to hurt you in return. Are you ready for that? No, Corinne said honestly, but I think I need to do it anyway. James nodded. He stood up and offered her his hand. She took it. His grip was firm and his skin was rough with work. I'm going to start a new project, he said. A community garden. I'm looking for volunteers and funding. If you wanted to help, you'd be welcome. No obligation, no expectations, but you'd be welcome. It was, Corinne understood, an offer of grace. Not forgiveness. James was right, he'd already forgiven her, but an offer of inclusion, an offer to be part of something real and good. Winter in Bellingham was different from Portland. Colder, grayer, the kind of weather that made you feel like the world had been drained of color and warmth. Corinne rented a small apartment, nothing like her Pearl District place, but clean and functional, and threw herself into the work of reconstruction. The first person she contacted was Todd Henderson, the purchasing director at Henderson's company. She'd made financial restitution, but she'd never actually spoken to him. I know I can't undo what I did, she told him when he finally agreed to meet with her at a coffee shop near his office. I know I can't take back the overcharging, the dishonesty, the fact that I treated your company like an easy mark. But I want you to know that I understand what I did, and I'm trying to do better. Todd was a man in his 50s, with the weathered look of someone who spent most of his time in corporate meetings and airport lounges. He listened to Corinne's apology with the expression of someone who'd heard many apologies and had learned not to trust them. Why, he asked when she finished. Why are you doing this? The money's already been returned. You're not getting your contract back. You're not getting anything from us. So why? Because it's the right thing to do, Corinne said, and she heard how inadequate that sounded. People don't usually do the right thing when they don't get anything out of it, Todd said. He stirred his coffee. I don't mean to be cynical, but I've been in business for 25 years. Most people, when given a choice between their own interest and somebody else's well-being, they choose their own interest. It's rare to meet someone who doesn't. I was like that, Corinne said. I might still be, but I'm trying to be different. Well, Todd said, I appreciate you coming to see me. I don't think it changes anything between our companies, but I appreciate it. It's rare. The second person was her former assistant, Rachel, who Corinne had been harder on than any other employee. Rachel had just been trying to do her job, trying to follow orders from her boss, and Corinne had treated her with constant criticism and impossible demands. Rachel agreed to meet her. Over coffee, Corinne was starting to spend a lot of her time in coffee shops, in conversations with people she'd hurt. Corinne made an apology that was more detailed than the one to Todd. I was cruel to you, Corinne said simply. I didn't value you. I treated you like a tool instead of a person. I'm sorry for that. Rachel's eyes got watery, but she didn't cry. You made me feel like I was worthless, she said quietly. Every day for the 2 years I worked for you, I felt like nothing I did was good enough. I started having panic attacks. I went to therapy. I still have nightmares about getting called into your office. Corinne sat with that truth without trying to minimize it or defend herself. I can't fix that, she said. I can't take back those panic attacks or that pain, but I want you to know that it was about me, not about you. It was about my own insecurity and my own need to prove something to myself, and I was wrong to take that out on you. Rachel was quiet for a long moment. Thank you, she said finally. I don't forgive you. I'm not sure I can, but I appreciate that you're trying to acknowledge what you did. It matters more than I thought it would. Over the course of the next 3 months, Corinne contacted everyone she could think of. Old friends who distanced themselves from her because of her sharp tongue and casual cruelty. Business partners she'd undermined. Employees she'd fired for reasons that seemed more about her own frustration than their actual performance. Family members she'd neglected or criticized. Some people responded with acceptance. Some didn't respond at all. A few sent her angry emails detailing the specific ways she'd hurt them. One former friend called her on the phone and told her that her apology would never be enough, and Corinne had to sit with that, had to accept it, had to understand that some damage couldn't be repaired no matter how much contrition you felt. But the most surprising responses came from people who saw her sincerity and responded to it with grace. I didn't think you had it in you, one former colleague wrote in an email. But I'm glad to see you trying. It gives me hope that people can change. And in those moments, Corinne felt something that she'd never felt before. Not the satisfaction of winning or succeeding, but the quiet peace that came from doing something hard simply because it was right. She started working at the community garden project with James. It was physical work, pulling weeds, building raised beds, turning compost, preparing the soil. It was work that had clear, visible results, where you could see the difference your effort made in a way that business had never allowed her to. James was a patient teacher. He showed her how to test soil pH, how to plant for seasons, how to plan a garden so that it would produce food from spring through fall. He introduced her to the other volunteers, a diverse group of people ranging in age from teenagers to people in their 80s. One of the volunteers was a woman named Margaret, who was in her 70s and had been volunteering at community gardens for 15 years. Margaret looked at Corinne with the sharp assessment of someone who'd seen a lot of people come through the gardens with good intentions and limited follow-through. You're not going to last, Margaret said on Corinne's second day, as they were both digging holes for spring bulbs. Why not? Corinne asked. Because this is hard, unglamorous work, Margaret said. It doesn't pay you anything. Nobody's going to know your name. You're not going to get business cards that say community garden worker. People like you usually last a few weeks before you get bored and move on to something that actually matters. People like me? Corinne asked. Rich people, Margaret said bluntly. Professionals, people who have never had to get their hands dirty for real. Corinne dug into the earth with the shovel. The ground was cold and hard, and it took real effort to break it up. I used to be like that, she said. I'm trying not to be anymore. Well, Margaret said, we'll see. Actions matter more than intentions. Come back in 6 months and we'll talk about whether you've actually changed. Corinne did come back in 6 months. She'd been working at the garden for 6 months straight, twice a week, in addition to the part-time job she'd found working as a bookkeeper for a nonprofit. She'd moved into a permanent apartment. She'd stopped looking at her phone every 5 seconds. She'd started being able to sleep through the night. On the 6-month anniversary, Margaret brought her fresh blueberries that had come from one of the garden beds Karen had helped build. "You're still here," Margaret said. "I am," Karen replied. "I underestimated you," Margaret admitted. "I thought you were just going to be another rich person playing at charity, but you're actually here, you're actually doing the work." It was the kindest thing anyone had said to Karen in months, and she felt tears prick her eyes. "I'm learning that the work is the point," Karen said. "Not the outcome, just the work itself." On one of the rare warm days in early spring, Karen was working in the garden with James when he asked her a question. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Giving up your business, your money, your status? Do you ever wake up in the morning and think, I made a huge mistake?" Karen thought about the question carefully. She could have lied and said no, could have claimed that she'd never looked back, but James had earned the truth. "Sometimes," she admitted, "especially when I'm broke and tired and my apartment is cold because I can't afford to turn up the heat very much. But the regret passes pretty quickly, because I realize that I'm actually happy for the first time in my life. I'm doing work that matters to me. I'm with people who see me and like me. I'm not pretending anymore." "What are you pretending about?" James asked. "That my life meant anything," Karen said. "That my success mattered, that I was a good person. All of that was pretense, and I was exhausted by it. This is exhausting in a different way, but at least it's real." They worked in silence for a while, turning the soil, preparing beds for spring planting. The sun was warm on Karen's face, and her hands were dirty with earth, and she felt more present in her own life than she'd ever felt before. "I have to tell you something," James said eventually, "about the messages you received, the ones that scared you." Karen looked up from her work. "It wasn't a vigilante neighbor," James said. "It was me." Karen felt something shift in her chest. "What?" "I didn't do it to be cruel," James said quickly. "I did it to push you. I was watching the Business Journal article come out, and I was watching you lose your clients, and I realized that you were going to fight through it. You were going to find a way to spin the narrative, to minimize the harm, to move on. And I realized that the only way you were going to actually change was if you felt threatened. If you felt like someone was coming for you the way I had felt like my entire world was coming for me." "You sent me threatening messages?" Karen asked, her voice very quiet. "I did," James said. "I'm not proud of it, but I wanted to scare you into actually confronting what you'd done instead of just doing some minimal restitution and calling it even. I wanted to crack the shell you'd built around yourself." Karen set down her shovel. She felt a strange mix of emotions, betrayal, anger, but also a kind of grim understanding. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. "Because you need to know," James said. "That forgiveness doesn't mean I thought you were right. I forgave you, but I also never stopped believing that you needed to face real consequences. And I guess I was trying to be the thing that pushed you toward those consequences. It's not pretty, and I'm not sure it was right, but it's the truth." "Did you know that the police traced it to my neighbor?" Karen asked. "Yes," James said. "I framed her. I spoofed my location through her router. She'll never know it, and there's no way to prove it, but yes, I made it look like she was doing it." Karen wanted to be angry. She wanted to feel like James had betrayed the apology and forgiveness he'd offered, that he'd been playing a game with her this whole time. But somehow, she couldn't quite find the anger. "Why are you telling me?" she asked again. "Because you're different now," James said. "Because I believe you've actually changed, and because I wanted to see if you'd judge me the way I judged you, if you'd think you were better than me because I'd done something wrong." Karen sat down on the ground. She thought about the fear she'd felt when she realized someone was watching her. She thought about the terror of not knowing who was after her, of wondering if there were more threats coming. She thought about how that fear had contributed to her breakdown, to her confession, to her reconstruction. "I don't feel like I have the right to judge you," she said finally. "I hurt you deliberately. You hurt me in order to make me better. They're different kinds of harm." "Are they?" James asked. "Or is harm always harm, regardless of the intention?" "I don't know," Karen admitted. "I'm still learning all of this." James sat down next to her. "For what it's worth, I regret it. I regret trying to manipulate you even if the outcome was positive. I regret using fear as a tool, and I regret lying to you about it." "Thank you for telling me," Karen said. "That matters." They sat in the garden for a long time after that, not talking, just being present in the space they'd been building together. Spring was coming. The seeds they'd planted would grow. The work they were doing would become something real and living and actual. And Karen understood, finally, that that was enough. That redemption wasn't about being absolved of all your sins by a higher power or by the people you'd hurt. It was about doing the work of actually changing, about building something real instead of something that just looked good on the surface, about showing up day after day even when it was cold and hard and nobody was watching. A year after she'd first encountered James in Westside Market, Karen was back in Portland for the first time since she'd left. The grocery store looked exactly the same. The same beige walls, the same worn rubber checkout belts, the same faint smell of industrial cleaner and produce. Karen stood in the parking lot for a long moment, steeling herself to go inside. Patricia was working the register. She looked up when Karen came in, and there was a moment of non-recognition before the memories clicked into place. "Karen," Patricia said, "I thought you'd moved away." "I did," Karen said. "I'm visiting. I wanted to come by and I don't know exactly, see where it started, I guess." "James left almost a year ago," Patricia said. "Did you keep in touch with him?" "Yes," Karen said. "He's doing well. He's building a good life up in Washington." Patricia smiled, and there was something genuinely warm in her expression. "I'm glad. He deserved that. He was always one of the good ones." Karen walked through the store, looking at the aisles where she used to work when she was in her 20s. It seemed impossibly small now, impossibly insignificant. But she remembered the ambition she'd felt here, the desperate drive to get out, to become someone important, to matter. She'd gotten out. She had become someone important. And then she destroyed all of that and rebuilt it into something that, paradoxically, felt infinitely more important even though it paid significantly less and carried no status. She went to the coffee shop down the street from the grocery store, the place where she'd met with Todd Henderson, where she'd apologized to Rachel, where she'd had dozens of difficult but necessary conversations over the course of the past year. She was sitting there with a cup of coffee she didn't really want, lost in thought, when someone sat down across from her. It was a woman she didn't recognize at first. Then the memories clicked into place. It was Rachel. But Rachel looked different. She was holding herself differently, more confidently, more present. She'd gotten her hair cut. She was wearing clothes that actually fit her body instead of hanging on it like she was trying to disappear into them. "I'm in Portland for a conference," Rachel said. "I saw you from across the street. I wanted to say hello." "Rachel," Karen said, and she heard the warmth in her own voice. "You look great. How have you been?" "Really good," Rachel said. She sat down and ordered a coffee. "I quit the business about 8 months after you shut down. I got a job at a nonprofit. It pays less, but I don't have panic attacks anymore. I actually sleep through the night. I have friends. Life is pretty good." "I'm so glad," Karen said, and she meant it completely. "I wanted to tell you something," Rachel said. "Your apology didn't fix what happened between us, but it did something. It showed me that I wasn't crazy for having that job. It showed me that the problem wasn't me, it was the environment. And knowing that made it easier to leave." "Thank you for telling me that," Karen said. They talked for an hour. Rachel asked about the garden work, about Bellingham, about how Karen was surviving without the corporate structure that had defined her life for so long. Karen asked about Rachel's new job, her friends, her future plans. "You know what's funny?" Rachel said as they were wrapping up. "I used to hate you, like real visceral hatred, but that's worn away. What's left is just. I can see that you were a person who did harmful things, but you're also a person who's trying to be different, and that's worth something." After Rachel left, Karen sat in the coffee shop and thought about all the ways a life could unfold, all the branches it could take, all the people you could hurt or help depending on the choices you made. She went to visit her mother that evening. Her mother lived in a house in the West Hills, a place where Karen had grown up and then worked very hard to escape. The house was the same, warm, cluttered with books and old photographs, smelling of her mother's perfume and the lavender candles she loved. Her mother, Margaret, not to be confused with the Margaret from the garden, was in her 70s now, and she'd aged in the way that people do when they've lived a life of quiet contentment. There were lines around her eyes from smiling. "Karen," she said when she answered the door, "I didn't expect you. Come in, come in." They sat at her mother's kitchen table, the same table where Karen had done homework as a child, where she'd sat during her high school years, planning her escape, and Karen told her mother the story. She told her about James Sullivan, about the grocery store, about the way her world had fallen apart and the way she'd been rebuilding it. Her mother listened without interrupting. She just sat and listened, the way she'd always done, with the kind of patient attention that Karen had spent her whole adult life trying to escape. "I used to wonder what I did wrong," Margaret said when Karen finished. "I always thought maybe I was too soft on you, too lenient, that if I'd been stricter you wouldn't have turned out so driven." "You didn't do anything wrong," Karen said. "I just made choices. I wanted things that I thought I needed to be happy, and I was willing to hurt people to get them." "Are you happy now?" her mother asked. "I know you've sacrificed a lot." "Yes," Karen said, and she realized it was true. "I'm happy in a way I never was before. I don't have money. I don't have status. I don't have any of the things I used to think mattered. But I have a life that makes sense. I have work that feels real. I have people around me who actually see me." Margaret reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. "I'm proud of you," she said. "Not because you got successful and not even because you admitted you'd done something wrong, but because you're actually doing the work of being a better person. That's harder than being successful. That takes more character." Karen came back to Bellingham late the next day. James was in the garden when she arrived, preparing soil for the spring planting. It was one of those rare warm days in the Pacific Northwest where the sun actually seemed to have warmth to it, and the garden was showing the first green shoots of new growth. "How was your trip?" James asked. "Hard," Karen said, "but good. I visited a lot of places I hadn't been in a while, people I'd hurt. And I learned that forgiveness is complicated," Karen said. "It's not binary. People can forgive you while still being hurt. They can accept your apology while not being willing to be close to you again. They can see that you've changed while still maintaining boundaries." "That sounds right," James said. They worked together in the garden for the next few hours. Karen had learned over the course of the year how to read the seasons, how to understand what the earth needed, how to build something that would sustain life. It was simple and profound, and it was nothing like anything she'd ever done before. "I want to ask you something," Karen said as the sun was beginning to set. If you could go back to before you lost your job, before your wife left, before all of it happened, would you change the choices that led to you getting hurt?" James thought about this question for a long time. "No," he said finally, "because all that pain, it led me here. It led me to this garden and to this life and to being the kind of person who could choose forgiveness instead of revenge. I might not have gotten here any other way. You can't get here from success. You can only get here from having everything taken away and then learning how to build something real." "I would make the same choice," Karen said, "even knowing how much it would hurt, because I'm happy now and I never was before." They stood at the edge of the garden as the sun descended toward the horizon. The sky turned orange and pink, and the earth turned golden in the last light. And Karen felt the weight of all the years before this moment, all the years of climbing, fighting, pushing, striving, lift from her shoulders. She was still broken, she was still learning, she was still making mistakes, but she was real now. She was actually here, actually present, actually alive in a way she'd never been before. The community garden had expanded to 3 sites across Bellingham. It was providing food to over 200 families. There was a waiting list of volunteers who wanted to help. Karen was no longer an apology in motion, trying to correct past wrongs. She was just a person working, building, living. She'd been interviewed by a local news station about the garden project. The reporter had wanted to know her personal story, the rise and fall and redemption narrative that would make for good television. Karen had told her no. "The story isn't about me," she'd said. "The story is about the garden and about what happens when people work together to build something real." The news story ended up focusing on the garden instead of on Karen, and she was grateful for that. She still talked to James regularly. His hair had gone completely white, and there were new lines in his face, but he seemed to be at peace with aging in a way that Karen suspected he never could have been before. He was volunteering at a homeless shelter, using his organizational skills to help coordinate resources. They had become friends in the way that people become friends after having passed through fire together. Not because they were similar, they weren't, but because they understood each other. Because they had been in the same hole and had climbed out by different routes but recognized the climb in each other. One day, Karen was in a coffee shop in Bellingham when she saw a woman who looked familiar. It took her a moment to place her. It was Patricia, the manager from Westside Market in Portland. Patricia was on vacation, she explained, visiting a friend who lived up north. "I can't believe I ran into you," Patricia said. "How are you doing?" "Good," Karen said. "Really good. How's the store?" "Oh, it's the same," Patricia said. "We miss James sometimes, but we got a good replacement manager. Things are fine." After Patricia left, Karen sat in the coffee shop and thought about how strange it was that the people who changed your life were rarely the people you expected. If James had never come into Westside Market that day, if he hadn't paid for her groceries out of kindness rather than calculation, if he'd chosen revenge instead of forgiveness, none of the rest of it would have happened. She might still be in Portland, still be building her business, still be climbing a ladder that only went up. She might still be convincing herself that money and status were the same thing as happiness. Instead, she had gotten a second life, a real one, and every day she worked in the garden, she was grateful for it. She was raking earth in one of the new garden beds when her phone buzzed. It was a message from Rachel. "I'm pregnant, I wanted you to know." Karen felt tears on her face as she typed back, "Congratulations, that's wonderful news." Rachel responded immediately, "I wanted you to know because I want to raise my child differently than I was raised. I want to teach them about kindness first, about the cost of success that doesn't include integrity. I want them to understand that being good matters more than being impressive. I learned that from you, even if I learned it by watching what happens when you're not those things." Karen sat down on the ground, holding her phone, reading Rachel's words over and over. She thought about all the ways that harm could ripple outward, but she also thought about all the ways that change could ripple outward. How one person's decision to do things differently could create possibilities for other people. How redemption wasn't just about fixing yourself. It was about showing people that change was possible. That night, she called her mother. "I love you," Karen said, the way she'd never said it before. Or maybe the way she'd said it differently before, with conditions and caveats. "I want you to know that, not because you've done anything recently, just because you're my mother and I love you and I'm grateful for you." Her mother cried on the phone. "I love you too," she said. "I have always loved you. Even when you were hurting people, even when you were running away from me, I loved you. I'm just glad that now you're here enough to let me." After they hung up, Karen sat on the porch of her small apartment and watched the stars come out above Bellingham. The city lights kept most of them hidden, but if you looked long enough, if you were patient, you could find them. She thought about the person she used to be, Karen Mitchell, consultant, businesswoman, someone who'd built a career on small dishonesty and careful manipulation. She couldn't even recognize that woman anymore. Or maybe she could, but she didn't hate her. She just understood her. Understood the fear underneath all that ambition, the insecurity underneath all that striving. She wasn't that woman anymore, and she would never be that woman again. But she also wasn't someone who'd erased her past or pretended it didn't happen. She was someone who'd lived through it and come out the other side. She was someone who understood now that the things that broke you could also break you open. That destruction could be the beginning of construction. That the life you built in the aftermath could be more real, more solid, more true than anything you'd built before. She was someone who'd learned that grace was possible, not the kind of grace that excused wrongdoing, but the kind that held space for change. The kind that James had offered her. The kind that she was, slowly, learning to offer herself. And she was someone who, on a cold night in Bellingham, on a porch overlooking a city full of people she didn't know, felt more at home than she'd ever felt in her life. The circle had closed, but unlike a circle, it wasn't an ending. It was just the beginning of a spiral, a continuation of the work, of the learning, of the slow accumulation of wisdom that came not from books or success, but from having lived, really lived, with all the consequences of that living.